The winter of 1571 enveloped Muscovy in a silence of snow and bells. Beneath the golden domes of the Orthodox churches, the city seemed to hold its breath. Inside the Kremlin, where the shadows of painted saints seemed to watch from the walls, a young woman of barely 19 walked toward what chroniclers would later call the most dangerous altar in Russian history. Her name was Marfa Sobákina, and with every step she took, the court plunged into a murmur of fear and fascination. No one knew it then, but an invisible substance traveled within her body, a dose of mercury that her mother had administered, believing it would offer her fertility and blessing. The sound of the choir ascended, mixed with the scent of incense and melted wax. The crowd of boyars, ambassadors, and priests watched her, searching her face for the reflection of purity and grace that a Tsarina ought to possess. Tsar Ivan IV, the Terrible, waited before the altar, his gaze fixed upon her, a gaze that blended devotion, suspicion, and a power so absolute that no mortal could hold it without trembling. They say that in that instant, when the priest raised the golden cross to bless the union, a gust of wind swept through the church and blew out one of the altar candles. The superstitious took it as a bad omen. Men of science, if they existed, remained silent. And Marfa, under the weight of her crimson brocade garments, felt the air grow heavy, unbreathable. Her mother, watching from the side pews, clasped her hands in prayer. She did not know that the remedy she had prepared, a mixture passed down by midwives from past generations, contained the same metal with which alchemists attempted to make gold. For her, it was an act of desperate love, to ensure her daughter's fertility, to guarantee that the royal womb would bear an heir. In a society where a woman's value was measured by the children she bore, motherhood was both redemption and condemnation. But what love ignores, poison reveals. As the choir sang the final verses of the nuptial office, Marfa grew pale. Some thought it was modesty, others religious ecstasy, but her hands trembled, and a cold sweat ran down the back of her neck. The priest finished the blessing, and Ivan, with a solemn gesture, placed the bridal crown upon her head. It was then that her body gave way. She fell to her knees fainting as the metallic sound of her jewels echoed against the stone floor. The onlookers recoiled in horror. No one dared to move. The Tsar leaned toward her, took her in his arms, and for a moment his face, that of the man who had ordered executions and tortures, became that of a confused, frightened, almost human husband. He ordered her to be taken to his chambers and demanded the immediate presence of his physicians. The banquet, prepared to last all night, was interrupted. The musicians fell silent and the wine turned bitter. The joy dissolved into a thick silence, as if the entire palace had understood that something sacred had been broken. Outside in the freezing streets, the people whispered that the new Tsarina had been chosen by the stars, that the priests had read her destiny in the heavens. Some said she was too pure for the world of men, others that Ivan's demons had claimed their tribute. The truth was crueler and more banal. The alchemy of ignorance had transformed an act of maternal love into a death sentence. In the bridal chamber, illuminated by braziers and silver candelabras, Marfa regained consciousness amidst murmurs and prayers. Ivan stood watching her with a mixture of anger and compassion. He had seen 2 wives die before her, and deep in his soul, an idea began to germinate that would soon devour his sanity, that God himself was conspiring against his lineage. The physicians prescribed herbs, prayers, and compresses of sacred ice. Nothing worked. Every day Marfa's skin grew paler, her lips grayer, her eyes more distant. In the corridors, the maidens whispered stories of curses, spells, and poisons. No one spoke aloud of the vial the mother had brought with her from Novgorod, wrapped in linen and hidden among the folds of her dress. As the illness progressed, the Kremlin clocks ticked down an invisible countdown. The astrologers knew it. The confessors feared it. Something ancient, an echo of pagan myths, had awakened once more. The union of power and innocence always demands a sacrifice, and in that palace of golden shadows, the sacrifice had a name and a face. 15 days later, the sound of the bells would ring out over Muscovy again, not to celebrate, but to announce the end of a life and the beginning of an era of paranoia and blood. But that was yet to come. For now, in the gloom of the wedding night, the poison began its slow prayer inside the body of the young Tsarina. Long before the poison pronounced its sentence, Ivan Vasilievich was already living in an invisible court where he himself was judge, prosecutor, and executioner. Since childhood, he had learned that the power of the Tsar was a sacrament smelling of incense and iron, anointed by God, but tested by the fire of hell. That double edge accompanied him like a broken prayer. At 41, having buried wives and children, he had become an armed penitent. He slept beneath icons blackened by smoke. He prayed with the hands that had also signed death warrants. Within him coexisted the monk and the executioner, and both looked upon Marfa as a promise that could not fail. Chroniclers describe him as tall, almost imposing, with a voice capable of turning into a knife. But beneath the armor of his title lay a fissure that grew like ice in wood, the certainty that his lineage was cursed if it did not produce an indisputable heir. In the liturgy of Muscovite power, a healthy wife was more than an affection. She was a theological seal, proof that heaven still tolerated his reign. That is why Marfa's fainting at the altar was not to him a gesture of weakness, but an omen. The Holy Fathers taught that evil slips through the cracks of the soul when pride opens the door. Ivan, however, saw evil in others, never in his own flesh. If something went wrong in his house, there had to be a heretic, a sorcerer, a foreign hand. His faith, though sincere, had become an armor that justified any blow. After the campaigns against Kazan and Astrakhan, having tasted conquest and betrayal, Ivan began to invoke an apocalyptic language. The world was a testing ground where the Tsar, like a new Josiah or a new Constantine, was called to purify his people. From this sprang the Oprichnina, not just a secret guard, but a theology of suspicion. Dressed in black, with dog heads and brooms as emblems, to sniff out treason and sweep it away, his men became a macabre procession that mixed mysticism with iron discipline. The capital learned to walk on tiptoe, like someone crossing a sanctuary full of traps. In that climate, the marriage to Marfa was a lit candle in a temple of cold drafts. The Tsar was trying to erect an altar to stability, bridal crowns, chalices, blessings, a whole grammar of symbols to convince heaven and earth that Russia would have a legitimate heir. But Ivan's biography was stitched with threads of mourning. The death of his second wife, Maria Temrykovna, had fueled rumors of poison, and each loss drove deeper the idea that hidden forces were working against his blood. Grief, when it finds no comfort, needs culprits. In Muscovy, the culprit was never an accident. It was always a face. Ivan's spirituality was not simple superstition. It was born of a tradition that viewed history as sacred theater. Byzantine emperors, martyr princes, holy prisoners. The Tsar considered himself the heir to that chain. Like so many kings of Europe, he believed his body was a map of the kingdom. If his wife withered, his empire was sick. If his bed remained barren, the throne tottered. Theology thus became a political diagnosis. And when theology diagnoses, the sword prescribes. In the hours following the ceremony, while Marfa struggled to breathe, and the physicians prepared herbal teas, Ivan walked in circles, barefoot on the floors heated by braziers. The servants avoided his gaze. He muttered psalms, but every verse seemed to be born accompanied by a question. Who? Who dared to touch what was consecrated? Doubt in his mind was not a passing shadow. It was a method. He examined the boyars as if they were forged relics. He smelled treason in the curtains, in the incense, in the way a guard blinked. He had learned to measure danger by silences and blinks, by rumors found between the lines in ambassadors' reports. His court was a cathedral of sheathed knives. To understand his delirium, one must look into the mirror of our own time. Today, too, the powerful speak of plots when chance becomes unbearable to them. The inability to accept fragility pushes one to seek conspiracies. But in the 16th century, without medical science to give names to poisons, suspicion was not only human, it was plausible. The remedies of the time coexisted with poisons in twin vials. Ointments that promised life contained seeds of death. Mercury, to which alchemists and healers attributed almost sacramental virtues, infiltrated the body with the obedience of a monk and the cruelty of a demon. How could Ivan not see, in his wife's agony, the signature of an enemy? Even so, there was a glimmer of the man left in the monarch. He sat at the foot of the bed, took Marfa's hand, and asked in a low voice for relics to be brought. A cross with fragments of holy wood, an icon of the Mother of God. He wanted to believe that the same God who had given him the sword would grant him a miracle. But miracles, when they do not arrive, turn into emotional gunpowder. Every hour without relief inflamed Ivan's old thesis. Evil hides behind the veils of love. If a mother's medicine could kill, then love itself required surveillance. Nothing, not even compassion, was beyond the reach of the Oprichnina. The Tsar thought of the precedents. He remembered the princes who, in earlier times, had fallen to poisoning, to real or supposed sorcery. Foreign diplomacy, Venetians, Poles, English, had made Muscovy a chessboard where every cup of wine could be an ambush. If the enemy could not defeat him on the battlefield, perhaps they would do so through his queen's womb. In the grim theology of his court, the bridal bed was an altar and a minefield. That is why, when convulsions shook the young woman's body, Ivan did not just see illness, he saw an invisible war. The figure of Marfa's mother then appeared like a shadow that fit into no category. Witch or martyr, ignorant or murderer. In a culture that measured a woman by her ability to give life, the attempt to ensure fertility could become, by dose or by destiny, a sacrilege. The Tsar did not yet know of vials or formulas. He did not know the word mercurialism. He did, however, know the language of punishment, and that language was awakening on his lips like an ancient prayer, learned by heart, ready to be recited as soon as death pronounced its amen. Meanwhile, the ambassadors translated silences. In ciphered letters, they described a palace that had gone from music to whispers, from laughter to the murmur of sandals fleeing down the halls. They claimed that the Tsar alternated between piety and outburst, that he kissed icons and then smashed goblets against the floor. They even said that the choice of a wife had been a gamble to tame the monster, that should it fail, the monster would go out for a stroll through the squares. In the monasteries, a hieromonk prayed for mercy for the young Serena. In the headquarters of the Oprichnina, the commanders sharpened decrees. Ivan was not going to accept that the tragedy was an accident. He needed a narrative that would restore coherence to his world. If the Tsarina fell, someone had pushed her. If heaven doubted, the earth had to speak in screams. And the earth, when it speaks and screams, does so in public squares. Thus was prepared, without anyone announcing it, the dark liturgy of what was to come. Interrogations, extracted confessions, lessons in terror. Theology would transform into procedure, suspicion into a list of names. While Marfa, consumed by a nameless fever, breathed at intervals, the Tsar made a silent decision. If God did not cure, he would purify. If heaven remained silent, he would scream for them both. Before the poison sealed her fate, it had all begun with a spectacle that claimed to be sacred. Muscovy, vast and cruel, was preparing for a political liturgy in the form of a bridal contest. Chroniclers called it the choosing of the Tsarina, but in truth, it was a ceremony of power, a sacrifice wrapped in gold. 2,000 maidens were summoned from the edges of the empire. Village girls from the northern forests, daughters of Novgorod merchants, young women from the Volga steppes. They all came with the same dream and the same fear, to be the chosen one of the most feared man on the continent. The road to Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, the fortress where the selection would take place, was a corridor of ice and surveillance. The soldiers of the Oprichnina guarded the caravans as if they were prisoners. Upon arrival, the young women were led to collective dormitories and examined as if they were relics. Physicians with cold hands and the gaze of a judge evaluated their purity, their fertility, their pulse, even the glow of their skin. Those who did not withstand the scrutiny were sent back in silence, without a word of comfort. What the priests called divine discernment was in reality an engineering of bodies. The girls became the raw material of a biological project, to create the perfect womb to bear an heir. In a society where the soul was invisible and the flesh suspect, a woman was at once an object of veneration and dissection. It was the distant echo of the Byzantine ritual, where royalty mingled with the liturgical and the Tsar's marriage imitated the divine incarnation. But beneath the cross, the political scalpel never stopped cutting. The czar's astrologers, scholars dressed in tunics embroidered with symbols, drew up celestial maps and traced correspondences between the stars and the bodies of the candidates. They looked for signs of harmony, but also omens of destruction. The fate of a nation could hang on a zodiacal ascendant. Foreign ambassadors, watching from a distance, wrote ciphered reports to their kings. They said the process was a mixture of mysticism and fear, a reflection of the Russian soul, beautiful and brutal, spiritual and bloodthirsty. As the days passed, the 2,000 young women were reduced to 24, then to 12. Among them, Marfa Sobákina stood out for her serenity. She was not the most beautiful, but she was the calmest, and in her silence there was something the elders interpreted as wisdom. Her eyes, noted a chronicler, are lakes where there is no storm. To Ivan, accustomed to screams and intrigues, that calm was a balm. But in the language of symbols, calm precedes catastrophe. The fortress of Alexandrovskaya was not a palace. It was an armed monastery. Masses and executions were held there with the same solemnity. Prisoners were tortured at dawn, while monks chanted psalms in the chapel. The smell of blood mixed with the incense. The young women, confined to their dormitories, heard the shrieks in the distance and understood that beauty could be as dangerous as sin. Whoever pleased the Tsar too much could end up in her grave. Marfa, the daughter of a wealthy merchant, represented a social novelty. She did not come from the traditional nobility, but from the rise of an urban class that was beginning to challenge the monopoly of the boyars. In her, refinement and simplicity were mixed. She knew how to embroider icons, but also how to negotiate prices. Her father, Vasily Sobákin, had amassed a fortune selling furs and spices. Her mother, a devout woman, saw her daughter's wedding as the family's consecration. "The Lord has looked upon our house," the neighbors said. No one imagined that this divine gaze brought with it the edge of misfortune. On the day of the announcement, June 26, 1571, Marfa's name echoed within the wooden walls of the main hall. The other candidates bowed their heads. The priest blessed the choice with holy water, and the Tsar's trumpets proclaimed the news. Messengers set off for Moscow to prepare the banquet. Meanwhile, in the fortress, a new tension took hold of everyone. The women whispered that the chosen one had coughed up blood that morning. The physicians denied it, the guards hid it, but the rumor slipped like a specter through the corridors. At nightfall, Marfa prayed alone in the small chapel of the fortress. Before the icon of the Virgin, she asked for the strength to love a man whom everyone feared. Behind the door, a guard watched her with respect and compassion. He did not know that this fragile figure, kneeling among candles, would soon become the catalyst for a fury that would mark the history of Russia. In later chronicles, this episode would be remembered as a beauty contest, but modern historians read it as a sacrificial ritual, a collective attempt to appease a monarch possessed by the fear of extinction. The young women were not competing for love, but for the survival of their lineage. And in that sense, Marfa did not win a marriage, but a sentence. From our contemporary perspective, the event reveals an eternal pattern. Women, reduced to instruments of power, offered in the name of stability, of honor, of the future. Thrones change, crowns change, but the altar remains the same. History does not repeat its scenes, it recycles them. What for the court of Muscovy was a sacred act, for posterity is a lesson on the distance between the divine and the human, between faith and fear. That night, as the bells marked the close of the day, the freezing wind shook the flames of the torches. Snow fell on the walls of the fortress, covering footprints and secrets. Inside, a mother could not sleep. In her mind, the shadow of infertility lurked like an inherited curse. Soon she would seek the remedy. Soon the poison would have a name. In Novgorod, the home of the Sobákins, the winter seemed longer than anywhere else. The wooden houses exhaled blue smoke, the rivers slept beneath the frost, and the women told stories by the warmth of the fire. Among those stories, there was one that mothers repeated in low voices. "Whoever fears barrenness, let her drink silver or mercury, for metals purify the blood and awaken the womb." It was an echo of alchemy, a dogma passed down between superstition and faith. In that archaic universe where medicine was still prayer and experiment, the line separating cure from poison was thinner than a wisp of smoke. Marfa's mother, Yelena, grew up hearing those secrets. She was neither a witch nor a healer, but a pious and practical woman, accustomed to fearing what she did not understand. When she learned that her daughter had been chosen by the Tsar, joy pierced her like lightning. At last, God had elevated her lineage. But along with the glory came anxiety. She knew that the monarch's previous wives had died without providing heirs, and that any woman incapable of conceiving became a living curse. A barren Serena is a sign from hell, a confessor had said in church. That phrase stuck in her mind like a nail. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Yelena visited an old woman known as the Vedunya, a kind of rural healer whose reputation wavered between respect and fear. She found her in a cabin surrounded by cats and vials. The old woman listened to her in silence, and then spoke with the voice of one who has seen too much. Your daughter will be queen, but not a mother if you do not purify her blood. There is a metal that lightens life, that cleanses the dark. I will give you a drop of liquid moon. The woman opened a small chest and revealed a vial containing a silvery liquid that gleamed in the firelight. Do not fear, child. The same metal that kills the sick can beget the healthy, if taken with faith. Yelena, trembling, accepted the vial. In her mind echoed the words of the priests. Faith moves mountains. If faith could move mountains, why not open a womb? That night, upon returning home, she placed the vial on an icon of the Virgin and prayed. She believed that in doing so, she was turning the mercury into a blessing. Ignorance, when clothed in piety, becomes sacred. The wedding was approaching and preparations accelerated. Among embroidered dresses and dowry chests, Yelena hid her vial. When she saw Marfa weak from exhaustion and rehearsals, she interpreted the symptoms as a sign of a lack of internal heat. It was then that she prepared the fatal concoction. She mixed a small amount of mercury with milk and honey, the traditional formula to facilitate conception. Drink it, my daughter, she told her tenderly. It is the blessing of mothers. Marfa obeyed. In the culture of obedience, love is in order. The following days brought a strange relief. Marfa felt stronger, or so she thought. The physicians attributed it to rest. Yelena, to her miraculous remedy. The court congratulated her on her dedication, and she smiled, not knowing that she had signed her daughter's death warrant. The alchemy that sought gold had found another transmutation, that of innocence into guilt. Meanwhile, in Muscovy, the air was heavy with omens. The augurs spoke of a dangerous astrological conjunction, Mars and Saturn in opposition, symbols of blood and ruin. The Tsar's theologians debated original sin, whether the suffering of women was punishment or atonement. None suspected that the answer was already in motion, coursing through the veins of a young woman who did not yet know she would die. Mercury, in the medieval mindset, was more than a metal. It was the ambiguous substance par excellence, half divine and half demonic. Alchemists called it aqua mercurii, the spirit that connects heaven and earth. It represented the soul in motion, capable of mutating, of healing or destroying. Its fluidity was a symbol of life, but also of deceit. In the monasteries, monks saw it as a metaphor for sin, brilliant on the outside, lethal on the inside. For a mother to offer it to her daughter was almost an inverted liturgical act, a black mass of love. Yelena, however, saw no blasphemy. In her mind, the act was pure, maternal, full of faith. If her daughter survived the Tsar, she would be remembered as a saint. If she died, as a martyr. That is how the logic of tragedies works. Every destiny seems reasonable when the outcome is unknown. The weeks passed. Marfa was moved to the Kremlin, where priests and physicians prepared her for marriage. Her mother accompanied her during the final day, adjusting her veil and whispering prayers. No one noticed that her hands were trembling. When the procession set off for the church, Yelena stood at the door, watching the snow begin to fall. In the freezing air, she thought she heard a crack, as if the sky were breaking. It was not the sky. It was history tearing open. That night, upon returning home, Yelena lit a candle before the icon of the Virgin and gave thanks for the marriage. Her heart was at peace. She did not know that the poison had already begun to speak, silently, inside her daughter's body. She did not know that, in the language of the gods, love does not always redeem. Sometimes it condemns. On October 28, 1571, the great bell of Alexandrovskaya Sloboda rang at dawn, marking the beginning of the imperial day. The air smelled of wax, incense, and promise. In the temple, decorated with winter flowers and Byzantine tapestries, Marfa Sobákina prepared to seal a fate that not even angels would have dared to write. Under the weight of her crimson dress, embroidered with gold threads, she walked with a trembling step. No one imagined that every step brought her closer to the abyss. During the ceremony, the Tsarina looked like an apparition. Witnesses said her skin had an unusual glow, almost translucent, as if light were passing through it. Even watched her with a mixture of desire and reverence. The priest recited ancient psalms, the candles flickered in the wind, and the choir sang of the blessed union of power and virtue. But when the priest pronounced the final blessing, Marfa lost her balance. Her head fell back, and a murmur rippled through the temple. Ivan, confused, caught her, believing it to be a fainting spell brought on by emotion. No one suspected that, at that very moment, the mercury was beginning its procession through her veins. The nuptial banquet unfolded with a tense joy. In the great hall, the boyars raised goblets of wine, the musicians played without conviction, and the maidens smiled out of obligation. Marfa barely touched her food. It was said that her stomach could not tolerate the meal, that her body was burning inside. The physicians attributed it to an illness of the air, a kind of nervous fever. However, the Tsar, ever vigilant, watched in silence. Every gesture of his wife seemed to him a sign from heaven or hell. When she dropped her goblet, the wine spilled across the tablecloth like blood. The silence was immediate. Ivan ordered her to be taken to rest. Night fell over the Kremlin. In the bridal chamber, embers burned in the copper braziers, silk curtains hid the walls, and the scent of amber mixed with that of fear. Marfa lay in bed, struggling to breathe. Her lips turned pale, her body shivered. Ivan, dressed in ceremonial robes, approached with the solemnity of one entering a temple. But what he found was not the mystery of love, but the prelude to death. His wife looked at him for barely an instant, with eyes that pleaded for help. Then a spasm shook her, and her body arched as if an invisible force were tearing it apart. The Tsar screamed for the physicians. They came with vials, ointments, prayers, and contradictory diagnoses. Some said it was a spell, others that the soul of the deceased Maria Temryukovna had returned to claim her place. No one knew that what was corroding Marfa was no spirit, but the liquid metal her mother had given her with love. The convulsions repeated. The tremors grew more intense. With every crisis, the Tsar knelt by the bed and recited prayers that ended up turning into insults. "Where are you, Lord? Where is your justice?" The following days were a way of the cross. Marfa could neither eat nor sleep. Her skin took on a bluish tint. Her hair began to fall out. The physicians spoke of an imbalance of humors, of internal corruption. None could explain it. Ivan, desperate, began to interrogate his servants. Who had touched the food? Who had prepared the infusions? The Tsar's eyes grew darker every night. The entire court trembled. No one slept well. Outside the walls, the people whispered stories. They said the new Tsarina was paying the price for some ancestral sin, or that she had fallen victim to a curse brought from the north. Others believed it was divine punishment for the crimes of the Tsar himself. The monks prayed in the monasteries, but their prayers arrived too late. In the logic of destiny, forgiveness always walks behind the crime. Modern science would later explain what was then incomprehensible. Mercury, absorbed slowly, destroys the nervous system, causes tremors, vomiting, loss of consciousness. But in the 16th century, illness was not a process, but a message. And the message Ivan thought he was reading was a single one: treason. For 15 days, the Kremlin became a golden prison. No one could enter or leave without permission. Ivan spent hours beside Marfa's weakened body, watching her waste away. His pleas mixed with his fury. Some claimed to have seen him beat his chest, weep before the icons. promise heaven that if she died, 10 guilty people would die with her. His advisors tried to console him, but the Tsar had already crossed an invisible border. He had ceased to be a suffering husband. He had transformed into a prophet of punishment. On November 13th at dawn, Marfa's heart stopped. The silence was absolute. Ivan remained by her side, motionless, holding her hand. They say his lips moved without sound, uttering prayers or curses. At some point he stood up, ordered the curtains closed, and said with a voice of iron, "If men have played with what is sacred, men will pay." The servants backed away. They knew what those words meant. In the Russia of the Tsar, death never traveled alone. Marfa's body was prepared for burial. They wrapped her in linen and carried her to the cathedral. Ivan walked behind the coffin, bareheaded, without shedding a tear. The crowd watched in silence. Some said the snow fell on his face without melting, as if nature itself feared to touch him. The funeral ended with a prayer for the soul of the Tsarina. But for Ivan, that prayer was a declaration of war. He had lost his wife, his potential heir, and his last hope for redemption. In his mind, the line between the human and the divine had been erased. If God remained silent, he would speak in his place. If heaven did not punish, he would be the punishment. And so from the bed of a dying woman, the storm was born. A storm that would stain the squares of Muscovy with blood, where the Tsar's justice would fall like a sword in the hands of a mystic executioner. What began as a wedding night would end as a funeral mass for an entire nation. The silence that followed the death of Marfa Sobákina was so dense it felt solid. In the Kremlin, servants walked on tiptoe, priests whispered prayers with trembling lips, and the bells, which should have tolled in mourning, remained motionless. But inside Ivan the Forum, something snapped with a noise that only demons could hear. For 2 whole days the Tsar did not speak. He spent hours in the gloom, kneeling before the icons, motionless as a statue, his eyes fixed on the image of the crucified Christ. Until at dawn on the 3rd day, he stood up, slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "Hell has entered my house, and it shall leave it through blood." Thus began one of the darkest purges of his reign. Later chroniclers would call it the fury of the holy widower. The first to be arrested were the doctors. They were dragged before the Tsar, covered in fear and sweat. Ivan interrogated them with the coldness of an inquisitor. "What did you give my wife? What were you hiding behind your herbs?" They babbled incoherent answers, speaking of imbalanced humors, of prayers that were not enough. One of them fainted before confessing. Ivan ordered him revived only to hear him scream more. Then came the maids, the cooks, the servants of the bridal chamber. Each testimony fed his fury. In his mind, everything was part of a plot. The envious boyars, the superstitious healers, even the monks who had blessed the wedding. Every silence was interpreted as guilt, every tear as proof. "The devil," the Tsar said, "does not enter through the walls, but through kisses." In the squares, the people whispered names. Some said the poison came from foreign hands, others that Marfa's mother had invoked spirits. And as the rumors grew, the Oprichnina sharpened its machinery. Its black-clad riders, with dog heads hanging from their saddles, roamed the streets like heralds of the apocalypse. They carried lists, seals, and torches. The smell of fear became as common as that of bread. One morning, drums echoed in Red Square. Thousands gathered without knowing what to expect. In the center, a pike had been erected. The guards brought in Mikhail Temryukovich, brother of the Tsar's late second wife, accused of conspiring with poison. No one understood the accusations. Everyone understood the sentence. The execution lasted 3 hours. They say Ivan watched from a balcony in silence, without blinking. When it was all over, there was a deathly silence. The Tsar only said, "Thus pays love when it forgets its obedience." Marfa's father, Vasily Sobákin, was summoned to the Kremlin. He was forced to kneel before the throne, while the Tsar walked around him like a priest inspecting a sacrifice. "Your daughter was a saint," Ivan said, "but her blood was corrupted. Someone from your house opened the gates of hell." Vasily denied it, weeping, swearing on the gospel. The Tsar did not execute him. He condemned him to something worse, monastic exile. He was sent to a remote monastery where he would die years later, consumed by guilt. His sons were not so lucky. 2 were secretly beheaded. Meanwhile, the interrogations multiplied. In the dungeons beneath the Kremlin, the screams of the tortured mingled with the prayers of the monks. The executioners used pincers, fire, freezing water, whips. They wanted names, always names. Fear became currency. No one trusted anyone. Some, to save themselves, invented culprits. Others preferred silence and died with their tongues cut out. In the records of the time, fragments of impossible confessions are preserved. I boiled the herbs. I mixed the ointment. I only prayed. None were enough to calm the Tsar. In the temples, priests preached about divine justice, trying to justify the unjustifiable. They said that the Tsar, in his fury, was an instrument of God, that his wrath purified the earth, that the spilled blood washed away sin. It was the theology of the sword, an inverted gospel where forgiveness became punishment. And in Ivan's eyes, the image of Marfa, pale and trembling, merged with that of Russia itself. If his wife had died, the country was also sick. If the royal body had been contaminated, only the purge could heal it. Foreign ambassadors sent coded letters to their kings. "The Tsar is possessed," wrote a Venetian. "He believes he hears the voice of God dictating names to him." A Polish messenger reported that Ivan spent sleepless nights, striking the floor with a staff, repeating, "Love is the devil's most cunning face." The shadows on the walls seemed to move to the rhythm of his delusions. But beyond the madness, there was a method. Every execution reinforced his power. Every invented enemy justified new loyalties. The Oprichnina was no longer a guard. It was a religion. The Black Riders confessed before killing, took communion afterward. In their hymns, death was a sacrament. And so, faith and violence embraced like two lovers who cannot tell each other apart. When the blood stopped flowing, the Kremlin smelled of smoke and incense. Ivan attended a private mass for Marfa's soul. The priest trembled as he offered him the chalice. The Tsar drank and muttered, "Now she is clean." No one dared to ask if he was speaking of his wife or his kingdom. The chronicles recount that after those executions, Ivan became more unpredictable, more silent, more devout, and more cruel. He prayed more than ever, but he also ordered deaths with a new, almost pious calmness. Marfa's tragedy had changed something fundamental. The man no longer distinguished between God's justice and his own. In his mind, both were the same voice. And that voice, that of the Tsar chosen by heaven, would continue to resonate for years, spreading its echo through villages and convents, until all of Russia became an altar, where faith and fear were the same thing. Years passed, and the memory of Marfa Sobákina transformed into legend. In the portraits commissioned by the Tsar, her face appeared idealized, soft cheekbones, a serene gaze, an almost translucent veil enveloping her like a specter. No one was to remember the trembling, the cold sweat, the agony. For official history, the Tsarina had died of weakness, of sorrow, or of a mysterious illness sent from heaven. But beneath the walls of the Kremlin, the old doctors knew that something else had happened. They kept silent. Silence in empires is another form of obedience. Over the centuries, the myth survived the dust. In 2009, a team of Russian anthropologists exhumed the remains attributed to Marfa Sobákina. The bones were surprisingly well preserved, as if the perpetual cold of Muscovy had wanted to protect them. In the laboratory, scientists extracted tiny samples and subjected them to chemical tests. The results revealed traces of mercury in the bone tissues, a footprint as subtle as it was definitive. The discovery confirmed what the chroniclers suspected, but with a modern chill. It was not a curse nor a spell. It was chemistry. Mercury, that liquid metal that fascinated medieval alchemists, was considered a divine element. In 16th century treatises, it was called the soul of metals, capable of purifying the body and balancing the humors. Healers used it to treat everything from skin diseases to infertility. They did not know that the same silvery liquid that seemed to cure killed slowly. Every dose was a gamble against fate. Medicine back then was not science. It was faith in flasks. The modern analysis of Marfa's bones offered a chilling picture. The mercury concentrations were high, but not enough to have killed her immediately. The poison consumed her little by little, day after day, until her body collapsed. The symptoms described in the chronicles, the trembling, the pallor, the hair loss, matched point by point with mercury poisoning. Her death was not a planned crime. It was a theological accident, a mother's love, transformed into the alchemy of death. But science could not answer the question that continued to hover over history. Did Yelena Sobákina know what she was doing? Church archives show that she was never officially tried. Some rumors say she was pardoned, others that she disappeared. Perhaps the Tsar understood, in the darkest depths of his conscience, that to punish her would be to punish devotion itself. For what difference is there between a mother who poisons unknowingly and a monarch who kills believing he is saving souls? Both are victims of the same deformed faith. Researchers also reconstructed Marfa's face from her skull. The image surprised the public. Not the beauty of a queen, but the fragility of a young girl. In her computer-reconstructed eyes, something could be perceived that history had not told: fear, fear and resignation. The portrait was briefly exhibited in the Museum of Moscow until the church asked for it to be removed. Some ghosts, a priest said, must rest. In parallel, historians reviewed the texts of the time. They discovered that the obsession with mercury was widespread. In monasteries, monks mixed it with honey to purify the spirit. In the brothels of Novgorod, it was used as a remedy for venereal diseases. In European courts, apothecaries sold it in flasks ornamented with crosses, convinced of its chemical holiness. Science and superstition were the same thing with different names. The most unsettling thing, however, was not the medical evidence, but what the Tsar's private letters, found in a forgotten archive, revealed. In one of them, Ivan wrote, "God showed me that purity can be as deadly as sin. Men do not die from malice, but from the love that blinds them." That phrase, more than any decree or execution, explained his mind. He was not seeking justice. He was seeking meaning. He needed to believe that Marfa's tragedy had a divine purpose, that her suffering was the seed of a future redemption. But history, like science, rarely offers comfort. The discovery of mercury not only rewrote a chapter of the Russian past, it exposed a universal truth. Poisons change form, but not function. In every era, human beings continue to believe in miraculous formulas to cure, to love, to master life. Today, mercury is called blind faith, misinformation, or power. And just like back then, we continue to drink it with hope. Marfa's bones were reburied discreetly, without an official ceremony. Some scientists left a note in the coffin: "May the truth set you free." An irony that not even medieval chroniclers could have imagined. Because the truth, when it arrives late, does not set you free. It only opens old wounds. And so, 4 centuries later, science closed the circle that superstition had opened. The dead Serena spoke from the dust, and her voice said what history always tries to silence: that love, without knowledge, can be the most persistent poison of all. Winter returned to Muscovy, but it was no longer the same. The wind blowing between the domes of the Kremlin brought with it echoes of a lament. The name of Marfa, repeated in a low voice by those who still dared to remember her. Her tomb became a place of silent pilgrimage. Some women left flowers and prayed for their fertility, others for her forgiveness. The myth had turned the Tsarina into a tragic saint, both a victim and a warning. In the popular imagination, her death was no longer a mistake, but a sign. The gods do not tolerate love that defies the mystery of life. For Ivan, however, that memory transformed into doctrine. His faith, previously wounded, hardened into fanaticism. He spent his nights writing decrees, his days dedicated to surveillance and punishment. His obsession with purity became a political system. He created blacklists, oversaw tortures, purged entire families. He called every execution a cleansing of the soul. The domestic tragedy had expanded to the size of the empire. In his letters to the monasteries, the Tsar wrote phrases that make even historians shudder. The poison was not just for her, it is in everyone, and I must expel it. The death of Marfa Sobákina had left a wound in his mind that never healed. From then on, his rule was a procession of suspicions. Chroniclers recount that the Tsar slept surrounded by icons and skulls, convinced that the saints and the dead were watching him. Every time a minister contradicted him, Ivan remembered Marfa. Thus begins treason with a sweet word. His pain had transformed into a moral compass. There was no longer any room for compassion in it. But beyond personal paranoia, the death of the young Tsarina marked a mutation in the history of Russia. What was once devotion became control, and what was once love became a mechanism of power. The churches preached obedience, doctors feared to heal without permission, mothers hesitated before offering a remedy. Fear became a method. The kingdom learned to survive without faith, only with fear. The following centuries inherited that echo. From subsequent czars to modern leaders, Ivan's reflection remained. The idea that order can be built on distrust. And at the bottom of that reflection, there is always a woman poisoned without knowing it. A body that symbolizes the price of control. Because every society that idolizes purity ends up sacrificing its innocence. In 19th century Russian literature, Marfa's ghost reappeared disguised in multiple forms. The holy wife who dies of melancholy, the betrayed virgin, the mother who confuses faith with guilt. Rimsky-Korsakov immortalized her tragedy in the opera The Tsar's Bride, where love and death sing a duet. The spectators, moved, left the theater with the feeling of having witnessed something more than a story, a warning. Beauty and obedience are weapons of power when combined with ignorance. In the church archives, some monks wrote marginal comments next to the Tsarina's name. She died from an excess of purity. That phrase, minimal and devastating, summarizes the essence of her fate. She died because someone wanted to guarantee her perfection, because love, in its most obsessive form, does not tolerate risk. In her death, a universal paradox is revealed. The more we want to secure life, the closer we are to destroying it. Today, tourists visiting the golden cathedrals of Moscow walk past her tomb without knowing who lies there. They do not hear the stories that the walls still murmur. But in the cold corridors, some guides in a low voice whisper the legend, "Here sleeps the Tsar's bride. She died for a drop of love." And the visitors, without fully understanding, feel a chill. Marfa Sobákina was not just a victim of her time. She was the mirror of a culture that confused faith with control, motherhood with sacrifice, purity with obedience. Her story reminds us that poisons change their names, but not their purpose. In every era, we continue to drink the promises that kill us slowly. Perhaps in the confines of the heaven she invoked so much, Marfa has finally found the peace she never knew on earth. Perhaps her mother still prays in eternity for the forgiveness that history denied her. But the truth is that Russia was never the same again after that wedding. Love became suspicion, and the throne, an altar of fear. Because every crown sooner or later ends up rusted by the tears of the innocent. And every empire, even the most sacred, dies in a room where love and power are confused.